Thank you again, Mr. Smith. The Sabbath, over the years, has been referred to as a test commandment. I believe many of us here in this room can say that we have been tested in that way. If I keep the Sabbath as God instructs, I might lose my job, and if I lose my job, then I lose an income, and I'll lose the house, I'll lose the car. I have my family business, and as it's starting to grow, all of a sudden I'm understanding the situation about the Sabbath. A huge portion of my business, my livelihood, takes place on Saturdays. How can I do that? The business will not survive. Or young adults, teens, are in the situation of trying to get in college, and every single class is important, and you get a teacher that gets a bit crossways with you because you're taking off for the feast, or in college, some situations the instructors require you to be there for a Sabbath, and you go to you go up a step to the academic dean, and the academic dean says, we just let our individual instructors handle it, and that's your problem, working it out with the instructor, and what the instructor says is what's going to happen, so I can't help you. And then we realize, okay, he's not going to accept that, my being gone for that Sabbath. If I miss that exam, then that's going to affect my ability to get into that 2-year program, that advanced program that I need to get in next. It's all going to come crumbling down. How can I do this? It's a test. It's a test. We've had tests. You and I have had tests over the years. The Sabbath is a test. Sometimes when we thought we passed the test 20 years ago, the test comes again. It comes in a little different way, but there it is. It's the Sabbath test again. I had about probably about a 25-year separation on tests, and specifically with the Sabbath day. They come back. What makes it a test? The test of it is that to go that direction and take that test and follow that test defies human reason and logic for it to work out. It does not make sense that it will happen. And logically, if it does not make sense that everything will work out, if I refuse to work on the Sabbath, when there's a shortage of good jobs, if I do this, I'm history. God has a test for us, but yet it does work out for us, as we've seen in our lives over the years. It works out sometimes where we finally go in and the boss says, okay, no big deal. You know what? We'll make it work. Other times it is a big deal and we've gotten fired only to get a better job with better pay. Sometimes that is the case. Sometimes we've had to take a lesser paying job, and that lesser paying job has had challenges with it and financial challenges as a result. But then we look back over the years and we realize there were other intangible blessings that came with that job that ended up working out. Maybe it was even the challenge of it's a sink or swim kind of a situation in my life that I'm really forced to grow. And we look back and see how God used that opportunity to help us grow spiritually. Lots of different tests. Some situations we've lost jobs and we've been without work for months and in some cases years, only to later get that work and see how God helped us through it, and then reflect on how it helped us also kind of reorient and make sure that our priorities are how they ought to be. And then we look back on that in time, thanking God for allowing it. Well, I want to talk about another test commandment today. It's not one of the 10, but it is a test commandment. And in a roundabout way, it is attached to commandment number 1 of having no other gods before the great God. The subject that I want to address today, and actually today and December 20th, is the subject of tithing. Tithing is one of our fundamental beliefs in the Church of God. It has been for many years. Tithing is something that I think most of us are very clear on, and we understand that. But it is something that is very important for us as well to recognize. Why do we tithe? What are the reasons for tithing? How does God feel about tithing? It is a test commandment. It does not make sense that if you take 10% out of your income and give that to God, and then save another 10% to spend 1 week out of the year, or by extension, the various holy days, that will help us get through our financial challenges that we face. 20% of our income, 1/5 of our income, a person coming into the faith all of a sudden is looking at the different teachings and seeing this thing about a tenth and then another tenth for the Feast of Tabernacles. How am I supposed to make it? It's a test. It's a test. For some people, as they think about that, they come to the realization, listen, I cannot afford to tithe. I can't afford to do it. For some people, tithing represents a huge test commandment. Let's turn to begin over in the book of James. I want to, before we get into the details of what we want to cover today, I want to just talk briefly as an inset subject, the difference between testing and tempting. I think most of us are aware of that, especially want to address this with respect to our young people here today, but to recognize the difference between testing and tempting. It's important to realize that God tests us with tithing, and God tests us in other things, but God does not tempt us. God does not tempt us. Satan is the great tempter. James 1:13, we've covered this before. You're familiar with this passage, but in talking about how we go through trials and tests and temptations, we see here in verse 12 that blessed is the man who endures temptation. Look at verse 13. Let no one say when he's tempted, I'm tempted by God. God can't be tempted by evil. Somebody can't tempt God to sin by evil, nor does God himself tempt anyone. God doesn't tempt. Then he brings out this element. Each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires. So we have these aspects of our very nature that, contrary to God's way of life, we allow ourselves to be pulled. We have desires absent of God's way of life that cause us, or that even our own nature, we want to do things sometimes that are not of God. Each man is tempted when he's drawn away of each one by his own desires and then enticed. The enticing often is that extra temptation, that enticing that comes from Satan, the devil. Very, very important to distinguish this. God tests for the reason of wanting us to do what's right. If God gives us a test or allows a test to come upon us, he does it because he wants us to pass. He wants to be there to help us, to pull us through that test. Satan tempts because he wants to see us fail. He's working and tempting. Again, playing off our own lusts and desires, he gets in there and entices because he's leading us to fail. We see a variety of examples of testing in the Bible, but let's talk about one. Genesis 22. Well, in fact, you don't have to turn there. If you want to, you can. It's the story, again, of one of the biggest tests that we see of the Bible in terms of God's tests. It was the situation of Abraham with sacrificing Isaac. Genesis 22, verse 1, it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham. Now, why did God do that? Well, boy, I'm thinking, there's something about that guy. I think he's going to blow it. He's weak in this area. And if I work it this way, I think he'll get up to the point where he's supposed to slay his son, and he's going to pull back, and he's not going to do it. Boom, I got him nailed. He blew it. I knew he would. You know, is that what God does? No. God tested him because God wanted to know that he would obey him. God desired to bless him abundantly, the Father of the faithful. God's desire was to bless him and give him an incredible abundance. But he wanted to see where his heart was. Does he really believe me? Does he really have faith that I will guide and direct him through this? It was a positive test that God gave him for Abraham's good. Okay, in contrast, we see aspects of temptation. Let's go to a one that we probably don't turn to as often when we think of temptation, but let's go to this one. 1 Corinthians 7. We covered this recently in our young married couples Bible study that we have once a month on Friday nights. Incidentally, if you would like to be a part of that, please get with us, get with Curtis and Brandy DeMore, and be sure to get in on that list and to meet with us. But one of the, we think of the temptation situations of Satan with Christ, the various temptations that he gave Christ after Christ fasted for 40 days. He wanted him to sin. He wanted him to turn away. We see an example of this that is an area of marriage that can be a factor for individuals, where couples sometimes struggle with this. This passage can be misinterpreted and used as a weapon for denial of intimacy, and it can also be used as a weapon to demand intimacy when relations are at a really difficult spot in marriage. But either way, this passage can be twisted and used in a wrong way. But let's get to the essence of it here. In verse 3, he says, "Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her." There is to be intimacy. That is a part of the marriage union. And likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife doesn't have authority over his own body. The wife does not have authority over her own body. The husband does. The husband has authority over the wife's body. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So then he talks about the marriage union, and he says, don't deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting. That is and prayer. That's one of those times when the intimacy in marriage doesn't take place, during a fast period. But then he says, come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. It's an aspect of marriage. It's part of the marriage process. It's an element of marriage that God said we should engage in, so that Satan does not tempt us, because Satan wants to get in there, and when this part of the marriage is not taking place, he wants to get in there with our own desires and entice us to go a different direction. And he wants to see us fail. He wants to see us falter. He wants to see us go away from God. That is the temptation. So we see a couple of examples there. We know that we have the factors: God tests us. We have the situation of sometimes Satan tempts us. And we have that third factor of our own individual lack of control, our own nature, our own desires, that we can allow Satan's temptations to get in there and trump that up even more. So we know that as we resist him and as we submit to God, resist the devil and submit to God, and make God's desires our desires, then as a result, Satan runs away from us. He leaves, as James tells us. Sometimes people think, well, why does Satan keep tempting me in this area? Why do I keep getting tempted in this area? The answer often, not always, but often lies in upon what or upon whom am I fixing my desires? Where are my desires? I've got to get my desires lined up with God's desires. So the temptation, again, not a test, but the temptation comes because of our own desires. Okay, with that said, let's come back to the test then of tithing. Tithing is not a suggestion for God's people. It's not a suggestion. If you feel it, if you really feel it's been a good month, you ought to tithe. No, it is a commandment by God. It is a commandment with huge blessings attached. Just as we reflect upon the Sabbath, and hopefully we're teaching our children the huge blessings, the tangible blessings that come as a result of keeping the Sabbath. But tithing teaches us to trust in God, to recognize that God owns all, to give to God like God gives to us and to give to others, to see how God provides in our lives, to rejoice with understanding as we keep the feasts with the second tithe. Well, what are we to tithe upon and what are we to not? Who should tithe and who should not? Is tithing required for New Testament Christians since the Levitical priesthood has been done away with? Is it required of us to do that? Some will say, well, I remember where Paul didn't even accept money. He didn't accept any financial support in this situation. So what about having a paid ministry today? Should we even have that? There are groups out there that one of the things that they tout is we do not have a paid ministry. You know, we go after the teachings of Paul, the way Paul was a tent maker. Paul didn't take any funds from anybody, so that's what we teach. And as if that is a key element to a recognition that we are the true church of God because we don't have a paid ministry. What does the Bible say about these things? I'd like to hit some aspects today of some of these questions and leave some of them for the next time. I hope to hit most of the questions that come up with tithing because it is a very important area. And we are... Did you see the full moon last night? It was very large. And I didn't see any nicks in it. I don't know if it was the perfectly full moon, but that means we're 10 months from the Feast of Tabernacles. So where are we? It's a good time to talk about the feast. It's a good time to talk about our tithes. Are we being faithful in our tithes? Some in God's church have struggled with tithing faithfully over the years. Struggled with tithing diligently and faithfully, just as some struggle with compulsions, addictions, pulls, whatever it is, bad habits. Some struggle with tithing faithfully. Some people's tithing approaches get them in trouble from time to time. Let's talk about some of those. One is the person that keeps tithes in the same checking account where they keep everything else. And so then, that month comes around and, I forgot to send my tithe in. And then they look, well, they had all these other bills and, I don't have any money. I don't have any money to send in. So is it a sin to keep your tithes in the second tithe, or is it a sin to keep first tithe, to have all of that we're sending in out of one account? No, not at all. But there is a diligence there. Some struggle with taking care of the things that they need to take care of first, and as a result, get in a situation. Some find themselves, I got in a tight spot. That's like, what's that movie? Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou? We're in a tight spot. They get in a tight spot. And then all of a sudden, I just really can't tithe right now until I can get this caught up and this caught up. And I know I'm making the same amount every month, but I had these bills and I couldn't tithe on that. But when this money comes in, I'm going to dedicate this amount in this month to my tithes for what happened back in November. I'll get that covered in January. Does not work. It causes problems. People that do that, if you have done that, I would ask you, has that problem gone away of meeting the deadlines when we need to meet them? It continues to come back at us. Where are we, and how are we with our tithes? Many don't struggle with it at all. They just do it because they've proven it. They tithe consistently and faithfully. Let's go to Deuteronomy 8 to begin. Tithing, as I think most of us are aware, is an old English term which means tenthing. Throughout the pages of the Bible, we see different reasons, different aspects, different characteristics of tithing. I'd like to hit basically 4 today. I don't think that they are the 4 aspects of tithing, but hopefully 4 that will serve as a good base to build upon the discussion that we have on the 20th when we go through other aspects of tithing. But let's cover them. Of course, we know that Scripture talks about God commanding it. This particular passage in Deuteronomy 8 is not speaking specifically to tithing, but it's talking about the greater understanding of the law and how we view God's law. Let's look here in Deuteronomy 8, verse 1. He says here, "Every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe." How careful are we with the tithes? That you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land of which the Lord swore to your fathers. We'll see here, and I hopefully we'll be thinking about the spiritual parallels to what Israel was experiencing physically, our spiritual parallels today with this. Verse 2, "And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness. He did it to humble you. He did it to test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. Tithing is a test commandment. He wants to know, will we keep his commandments or not? So he humbled you. He allowed you to hunger. He fed you with manna, which you did not know, your fathers didn't know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. That is faith. That is the understanding of faith, of that, well, we're out here in the desert. How are we going to be taken care of? I'm in this tight situation financially. I'm making this much, and it doesn't make sense for me to be able to tithe. How am I going to make it? We are tested so we can learn that man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. It's a test. It's not logical. Your garments didn't wear out. Your feet didn't even swell these 40 years. You should know in your heart that just as a man chastens his son, the Lord chastens you. Therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God to walk in his ways and to fear him. For God is bringing you into a good land. God is bringing us into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains, of springs that flow out of the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. So he says, when all this happens, he says, and you've eaten and you're full, don't forget, verse 11, the Lord your God by not keeping his commands. Getting a little slack on these things and walking away from these things, his judgments, his statutes, which I command you today. Lest this happens and your heart gets lifted up, verse 14, and we forget the Lord your God who brought us out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led us through, and instead, verse 18, you shall remember the Lord your God. It is he who gives you power to get wealth. God owns everything. God is the one who gives us power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he swore to you, to your fathers, as it is to this day. We are, the first point in looking at this is that tithing is one of the methods God gives us as a way to worship him and to recognize him as the great creator God that he is. Do we think of tithing as a means of worshiping God? Do we think of tithing as a means of honoring him? Do we think of tithing as a way to recognize him in every way? As we've stated in our tithings, in our writings over the years, let's turn to Proverbs 3. Proverbs 3, a passage we often hear read at feast time as we prepare to take up an offering. But as our writings have stated over the years, tithing is first and foremost an act of worshipful recognition of God as the source of our existence and all blessing and providence. He is the source of everything good. And as a result, we are to give back to that source. It's all his, and he desires to give it to us. Proverbs 3, verse 9. We'll read verse 9 only, but we'll come back in a bit. Honor the Lord with your possessions. Honor him with those. Honor him through possessions. Sometimes that involves offerings. Sometimes that would involve tithing. But we honor God with that. And with the first fruits of all of our increase. Now, we look at that term increase. We'll just briefly mention it now because as we begin to answer when to tithe and when not to tithe, increase is a factor in that. What is it to have increase, and also to what degree in terms of tied with effort and labor? Again, we'll get into that in more detail later, but it's very important in distinguishing what is to be tithed upon. Let's look at Genesis 28. Tithing involves honoring the Lord. We see a few different examples in the Old Testament where tithing actually predated what we see listed in the descriptions that he gives to Israel and the Levites as they're in the wilderness heading to the Promised Land. There are predated examples of that. One of those is found in Genesis 28. Yeah, we'll start here in verse 11. Here Jacob on the go, and he was blessed by by Isaac, and this is where we see the dream of Jacob's ladder. So he took one of the stones of that place, not a Posturepedic pillow, but a stone, and lay his place of that place and put it at his head, and he lay down at that place to sleep, and he dreamed. And behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached to heaven. And there the angels of God were going up and down, descending and ascending it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. Saying this to Jacob, the land on which you lie, I will give to you and your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and the east, to the north and the south. And in you and in your seed, again, speaking of Jesus Christ, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, and Christ was of that seed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I've done what I've spoken to you. So Jacob awoke and said, well, surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So verse 18, Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put at his head. He set it up as a pillar, and he poured oil on top of that stone, and he called the name of that place the house of God, Bethel, where it had previously been named Luz. Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me, and if he'll keep me, and keep me in the way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. Verse 22, and this stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house. And notice that last statement. And of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth, a tithe to you. By tithing, we are worshiping God. It was a means of which Jacob used to worship God and honor him, and to also demonstrate his total and complete reliance upon God as the one who was going to look after him and care for him. Tithing was completely connected to that. It's an affirmation that we look to him to see us through to the end. Just as we sang a few minutes ago, God will see us through. One of the reasons and the ways that we affirm that we believe that is to tithe, and to tithe faithfully. Matthew 23:23, let's look at that. These are some familiar scriptures that speak to tithing. This passage discusses how everything was out of balance with the scribes and Pharisees, not thinking about the weightier matters of the law, leaving those things undone. We see, but nestled in this passage, we see a very important statement about tithing. Matthew 23:23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint, these small bits of spices here and there, and he said they're very diligent in paying that tenth of mint and anise and cumin, and yet they neglected these weightier matters, the all-encompassing concepts of the law: justice, righteous judgment, mercy, and faith. These things he said you ought to have done, but you shouldn't leave the others undone. So the tithing, Christ was saying, we still need to tithe, and yes, to tithe faithfully on that mint, anise, and cumin, and your increase in that, to tithe on that, is to be done without neglecting the bigger picture. So God says to do it, we are to do it, we are to follow that, and we strive to do so, and we need to do so with diligence. In doing so, it shows a reliance on God to look after us, as Jacob mentioned. Okay, second point, we won't spend as much time on this aspect of tithing, but it is critical. Not tithing is breaking the 8th commandment. How many of you are considering going out and if nobody's looking, I can go out and smash a window and maybe get a Garmin or something from somebody's car in the next 15 or 20 minutes. Sell it on the market, do pretty well probably if you don't get caught, if you wear gloves. How many of us are thinking about doing that? But that is what not tithing is doing. We are stealing. We are stealing from God. Very, very serious statement. One of the most familiar passages with respect to tithing is found in Malachi 3 that mentions that. Malachi 3, verse 8. Keep your finger there. We'll come back to it. Malachi 3, verse 8, he says, will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me, he says. But you say, well, how have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. We can rob God by not paying our tithes and offering. It's a very important concept to consider when a person is thinking, I can't afford to tithe. I can't afford it. My budget is too tight. Let's go to Leviticus 27. I think about when I hear that, I think about the statement in Ephesians 4 that says, let him who steal no more, but rather let him labor, that through that work he can then begin, or she can begin, to accumulate the funds to be able to give to others. And by extension, the principle of tithing, I believe, can also be nestled in that statement in Ephesians 4:28. Let him who let him who is stealing from God by not paying tithes faithfully, steal no more. No, do not steal anymore. I am not going to steal from God by not tithing to him faithfully. I am going to not steal. I am going to tithe to him faithfully, work and receive that blessing, those blessings from God, so that I can be in a position to give to others. It is not logical. It is a test commandment, but it is a very powerful test commandment that works. Leviticus 27, verse 30. The person that says, I can't afford to tithe, at that point, the person that thinks that, if we ever think that, we should pull back and say, no, can I afford to steal from God? Can I afford that in my life? Can I afford to steal from God in any way? I can't. I can't afford to steal from God. Leviticus 27, verse 30 makes this statement with respect to the tithe. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land, very agrarian society that they were coming into, or the fruit of the tree, all of the tithe, the tenth of the land, is the Lord's. And here's another important concept. It is holy to the Lord. The tithe, the first tithe, is a holy tithe. God considers it very, very holy. It is not to be dealt with flippantly. I remember a story, I can't remember if I've told you this or not, but it was a minister who shared this with me. I can't remember if I heard it in college or if I'd heard it back in my local church area where he was pastoring, but he told about a situation where he and his wife were all of a sudden experiencing these financial challenges. Well, they were hit with this, then this broke down, and they were thinking, what is going on? This is just strange how it's just boom, 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 hitting us like this. He said, we both got on our knees and prayed about it. God, please help us. If we're doing something that we shouldn't be doing, let us know, but please guide us through this. And a thought came to their mind about one of their tithe checks. They thought, what that one check, what did we do with that? We remembered writing it, but what do we do with it? And they got to looking, and they found the tithe check. It was in a stack of envelopes, and it was about 2 months old, and they thought, we better get this thing sent in. They stuck a stamp on it, sent it in, and the financial challenges went away. Now, were they being flippant? No. I mean, these things happen. Was it an intentional thing to misplace it? And no, it was totally unintentional. And yet at the same time, they chose to look at that from a standpoint of, we were not as diligent as we should have been in taking care of the holy tithe. We will make every effort from this time forward to handle that very, very seriously and get that to God, because the tenth is the Lord's. Now, does that mean that if we get that envelope or have that automatic deposit sent every time at the beginning, that we'll never have financial challenges? That doesn't mean that at all. But there is a faithfulness there that, again, he chose to pull back from that and think about, I better be very, very careful about that. Those of us that are, and I know it's different for folks with, and we'll talk about this next time, but folks in businesses and payments come in at different times, and you have different expenses that are laid out for the business to run. So sometimes it takes a while to determine increase and all of that. It takes time. But those of us who are in jobs where we get paid pretty regularly, either every week or every 2 weeks or every month, how diligent are we with that? As soon as we get that check, what's the first thing that we do? Are we right off the top taking care of that tithe? I need to take care of that 10%, get that sent because it is the holy tithe. And that second 10%, am I setting that aside for the feast? Do we do that off the top, or do we let it kind of float in as we deal with the finances over the month and as we get everything else paid? I submit to you that it is the holy tithe, and the degree to which we follow that is the degree to which we are pleasing God. Malachi 3 comes back to that concept with respect to that thing of recognizing that we are stealing if we do not do so. Malachi 3, let's go back there. Verse 9, you are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. There is a curse aspect to that if we do not take care of the tithe with diligence. So may we recognize that, okay, again, we see what about commandments, honoring God above all, the first commandment, but also this commandment of stealing. Okay, let's look at a third one and stay in Malachi 3. The third reason, or the third aspect of tithing is represented by our understanding that obedience to God and tithing to Him diligently brings forth incredible blessings from God. This is the familiar promise that God says to test Him in this in a right way, in a positive way. But He says in verse 10, bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and try me now in this. In a sense, test me in a positive way, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such blessing, there will not be enough room to receive it. Let's look at, we'll talk about that here in just a second. Let's look at another passage, Proverbs 11. Proverbs 11. God says we are to test or prove Him in this. It is a matter of faith. It defies human reasoning and logic that if we put these things aside and give what is God's to God and set up the other, that it's going to result in blessing. But we know the passage of Luke where it talks about being of a giving spirit, of giving to God, of giving to others, to become givers like God in Christ, and see how it's pressed down, shaken, and pressed down so compact, and still it is overflowing with blessing that comes out as a result of it. Proverbs 11, verse 24. Proverbs 11, verse 24. He makes the statement here, there is this principle here. There's one who scatters, that's in the process of giving, that gives to God abundantly and gives to others abundantly, and yet, strangely enough, the person increases more. And there's one who withholds more than is right, and it ultimately leads to poverty. That does not make sense, but that is a principle of God. The generous soul will be made rich, and he who waters will be watered himself. The people will curse him who withholds grain, but blessing will be on the head of him who sells it. He who earnestly seeks good finds favor, but trouble will come to him who seeks evil. He who trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like foliage. The final bit of Proverbs 3 in verse 10 states, as we honor God with the first fruits of our increase, our barns will be filled with plenty, and our vats will overflow with new wine. I think of an example for us in our situation as we graduated from college and had to deal with the expense of moving from California all the way to Columbus, Ohio, and get a job. I've told you before, I got a job as a copier salesman, and it was we got $1,200 a month, and it was what's called draw against commission. So you got a $1,200 draw, and you didn't make any more than that $1,200 until you met your $1,200 in commissions. And there were times that I didn't make my draw. There were a few times that I made over my draw, but I had expenses for the van that I had to buy to take the copier around, gas expenses. And I mean, we were just struggling to survive on that kind of an income per month. Now, and we look at that, and it was a very, very, very difficult time. Also, that was the time when we tithed on our gross, and another aspect, it was our third tithe year. So it was just a very, very tight time. But at the same time, I look back on that time and all the things that we went through, there was this other principle that took place. It seemed like everything that should have gone wrong on our car and on our vehicle and all these other things, it didn't go wrong. And we were able to, well, when I got the next job, I got hired on by the college and then got the next job, then all of these things started breaking down on our vehicle because we could now pay for it. But God helped us out in the other way of getting us through those times without completely dying financially. We had very little. Our big day was Sabbath afternoon. We'd come home. We had the homemade pizza that we made, put on the ground beef, and we're basically just cheese for Lisa, ground beef for me. I like a few more things on my pizza now, specifically green olives, but didn't understand that at that time. But we also saved up our money, and we could get the Coke bottles. Back then, Ohio had the 16-ounce Coke bottles, but I just remember coming home. We couldn't use the gas heat there because it was too expensive, but my dad had given me this portable kerosene heater that, you got somewhat nauseous and a bit dizzy from the smell of it, but you stayed very warm. And with the Coke kind of knocked back the dizziness. And it was just, I remember those afternoons of just relaxing, the Sabbath afternoon, having our pizza and our Coca-Cola in a bottle, and we were blessed. I mean, we were very blessed. And as we look back on our lives, it talks about the riches that will come to us. Am I a multimillionaire? No. But I can honestly say that Lisa and I are so blessed in so many ways that I just can't even describe how blessed it's difficult to describe all of the blessings that we've been given. And I come back to an element of that is the principle of the 10th commandment of tithing. God blesses us in so many ways as we are diligent to Him in this regard. He blesses us physically. We have never gone without in terms of starving for days and days at a time. Paul starved for a while, but we've been looked after, and we've had tremendous blessings both physically and spiritually. So obedience to God brings forth blessings in this regard. The final reason that I want to spend some time on as we spend the next 15 minutes or so in looking at this is one that a question that arises that I brought up to some degree earlier. We'll finish the discussion next time, but how do we know whether or not tithing was done away with in the book of Hebrews, along with the other sacrifices? We don't sacrifice animals here anymore. We understand Christ's role in that. Well, what about tithing? Tithing was connected to the Levitical priesthood. Where does the church stand on that, and why does the church say that tithing is a command of God to this day, with the Levitical priesthood being done away with? So let's look at that. Let's begin by going to Genesis 14. We believe and we teach that this fourth aspect is that tithing has continued and still continues through the various administrations of the church. There have been various administrations of the church. The Levitical priesthood was not the original administration of the church. It's predated by the Melchizedek priesthood. And so let's look at that Melchizedek priesthood today. And through that, through the tithes and the offerings, through the various administrations. As a result of that, the work of the church, the work of the of the temple and for the temple is continued through tithes and offerings through the various administrations. Very important point. Genesis 14 deals with the story of Melchizedek, this king priest, this priest king of Salem, of what was to be Jerusalem. Of course, we recognize, believe that this individual was Jesus Christ. And we see that from some of the words that are written in Hebrews 7 about this individual. So here Abram goes through the situation of helping Lot get rescued, and in this battle there are spoils that they gain from their efforts in rescuing Lot and family members. So we come here now to verse 16. Genesis 14, verse 16. So he brought back all the goods, talking about Abram, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. Got them all back safely. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Cordoba. Come drive a Chrysler Cordoba. I'm struggling with that word. Kedorlaomer. No wonder why he got defeated. Can't even say his name. But anyway, and the kings who were with him. Verse 18, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He brought it out to Abram and his group. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abram and said, blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he, Abram, gave this individual, the priest of the Most High God, a tithe of all. Predating Exodus, predating the Levitical priesthood, this high priest, recognized as the high priest of God, was the one who received the tenth from Abram. So anyway, so he did that and did it honorably, and it was gladly accepted with that in mind. Prior to the Levites, the priest of the Most High God. Let's go to Numbers now. Numbers, and we see a change in that. We see a change to where the Levites take on that role. Now, within the Levites, you have the priesthood. So not all Levites are in the priesthood, and not all, but all the priesthood are of Levi, are of the tribe of Levi. So we see here in Numbers 18, let's look at this, verse 20. Numbers 18, verse 20. So he says, then the Lord said to Aaron, the high priest of the tribe of Levi, Aaron, you folks, you shall have no inheritance in their land, in the land that they're going in to Israel. You will not have an inheritance in their land. No, you won't have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the children of Israel. Behold, verse 21, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes in Israel as an inheritance in return for the work. They are working for that, and they receive the tithes from Israel for the work which they perform, the work of the tabernacle of meeting. Verse 22, hereafter the children of Israel shall not come near the tabernacle of meeting. No, that's not their role, lest they bear sin and die. But the Levites shall perform the work of the tabernacle of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that among the children of Israel they do not have an inheritance. For the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer up as a heave offering to the Lord, I have given to the Levites. That's the Levites' inheritance. Therefore I have said to them, among the children of Israel they shall have no inheritance. So then continuing in verse 25, so the Lord spoke to Moses, because we see another couple of principles here that we want to address. The ministry, the ones who are serving in the ministry then, as Levites, who served as ministering servants there, had a responsibility as well, as do we now in the present ministry. Speak thus to the Levites and say to them, when you take from the children of Israel the tithes, which I have given you from them as your inheritance, then you, Levites, you shall offer up a heave offering of it to the Lord, a tenth of the tithe. That's not the tithe of the tithe that we talk about at the feast. We'll talk about that next time. But a tenth of the tithe. So what they're saying is you're getting tithes in, Levites, and of what you get in for your labors, for you to live off of, you better give a tenth. You give a tenth to God as well. And we do that to this day. Your heave offering shall be reckoned to you as though it were the grain of the threshing floor, as the fullness of the winepress, as if you'd been there doing all that and gotten reaped in the blessings and given that tenth. So therefore you shall offer a heave offering to the Lord from all your tithes which you receive from the children of Israel, and you shall give the Lord the heave offering from it to Aaron the priest. So it was given to Aaron the priest. Abram gave the offerings to the high priest at the time. That was Melchizedek. Even the Levites were to give an offering to the high priest, Aaron the high priest, a human being. Of all your gifts you shall offer up every heave offering due to the Lord, from the best of them, not just anything, as Malachi's book brought out that they weren't doing that, but from the best of them. The Lord consecrated part of them. Therefore you shall say to them, where you have lifted up the best of it, then the rest shall be accounted to the Levites as the produce of the threshing floor, and as the produce of the winepress. You may eat of it, eat it in any place, you and your households, for it is your reward for your work in the tabernacle of meeting, and you shall bear no sin because of it, when you have lifted up the best of it. But you shall not profane the holy gifts of the children of Israel, lest you die. The ministry to this day, as they receive the tithe, they recognize that the office that administers the tithes in the various functions, they take that very, very seriously. We do not want to profane any of the holy tithe that comes in from the brethren, that holy tithe that is the Lord's. Let's look at an example of this in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, I think, is a great description of how that became problematic. Nehemiah had come in the mid-400s and helped with the rebuilding of the wall to protect Jerusalem and helped restore, again, a revitalization of proper service to God. One of those areas was in the area of the temple and how the temple was to be looked after. Verses 44 through 47 of chapter 12 give an expression, a description of how all of this got restored. But chapter 13 talks about the problem that happened that ultimately resulted in everything getting restored. So I guess let's read the problem first. Nehemiah 13, verse 1. So they read from the book of the law of Moses, the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever come into the assembly of God. Don't bring them into that presence there. They didn't, back when Israel was coming into the land, they didn't meet the children of Israel with bread and water, but instead they hired Balaam against them to curse them. God turned it, incidentally, into a blessing. So it was when they heard the law that they separated all the mixed multitude from Israel. So now he says, and here's what happened before this that kind of led to it getting all taken care of. The priest at the time, Eliashib, having authority over the storerooms of the house of God, was allied with Tobiah. Now, Tobiah was a governing individual who managed some of the land in the area, but he was an Ammonite. So Eliashib got mixed in with this fellow Tobiah, an Ammonite, and what Eliashib had done was prepare for him a large room, verse 5, where previously the grain offerings and the frankincense and the articles and the tithes of grain and the new wine and oil, which were commanded to be given to the Levites and the singers and the gatekeepers and the offerings for the priest, all of those storage areas, they said, you know what, he needs some space. We got to give Tobiah some space to function. And so he had brought this guy in there and cleared out all that material. Some even wonder to what degree Eliashib may have been involved in not managing that properly and pilfering some of the things that had come in. But as a result, we see a situation where the tithes weren't being collected. What did that result in? Well, it resulted in major problems at the temple. Let's continue here. So, verse 6, Nehemiah says, I was not there at the time. In the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone back to the king for a bit. Then after certain days I obtained leave from the king, and I came to Jerusalem and discovered the evil that Eliashib had been getting involved with Tobiah, in preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. It grieved me bitterly that he had done this. Therefore, I got in there and threw out all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room. What's that remind you of? Christ came in and saw what was happening, and he threw it all out of there. What is this? This is the house of God. He got that and cleared it all out. Verse 9, then I commanded them, cleanse these rooms, and I brought back in to them the articles of the house of God with the grain offerings and the frankincense. And now we come to the key point that we want to make here. I realized that the portions that were dedicated for the Levites had not been given to them. For each of the Levites and the singers who did the work, they were back out in the field. Well, is that supposed to be happening? They're supposed to be looked after by the tithe so they can do the service to the temple and service to the people in their roles that God had ordained them to fill. So as a result of their not getting that, they're out laboring in the fields to work, and they're neglecting the house of God. God was not happy with that. So he says in verse 11, I contended with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their place. Think about the spiritual parallels of that today. He says, verse 12, then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain and the new wine and the oil to the storehouse, and he got some people whom he could trust. I appointed as treasurers over the storehouse Shelemiah of the priest, and Zadok the scribe, and the Levites, Pedaiah, and next to them was Hanan the son of Zaccur, the son of Mattaniah, for they were considered faithful, and their task was to distribute to their brethren. They took that on very seriously and responsibly. I would like to do a message on this one day, but in verse 14 we see several of these, what I would call remember me statements. Nehemiah makes 4 or 5 of these in the book. But he says this, he wants to reflect upon and wants God to acknowledge that, listen, I did this because I believe this was right, God. Please remember me for it. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for its services. 2 final passages today. Let's go to Hebrews 7. Hebrews 7. We have the Melchizedek administration, and then we have the Levitical administration, and then we see in the New Testament a change away from the Levitical system to the Melchizedek line, the Melchizedek priesthood once again. And this is an important point with respect to tithing. So Hebrews 7, of course, we recognize that Melchizedek was Jesus Christ, as we see the description of this individual in Hebrews 7, verse 1. This Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham, as we read the story, to whom Abraham gave a 10th part of all, first being translated king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace. This individual did not have father or mother, no genealogy, no beginning of days nor end, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. He remains that priest. We understand that person, that being, to be Jesus Christ. Now, verse 4, now consider how great this individual was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a 10th of the spoils. And indeed, those who are of the sons of Levi, the next administration that followed that Melchizedek priesthood, the sons of Levi who received the priesthood, have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law. That's from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Now, beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Here, mortal men, Levites, receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. Even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, as we read. The Levites paid tithes to the high priest, so to speak, or in a sense, he paid tithes through Abraham because they're in the loins of Abraham. But anyway, he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So, verse 11 then, therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be called according to the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed. So here's another administrative change. It is changing from Levites to the Melchizedek priesthood. For the priesthood being changed, of necessity there is also a change of the law. What's that change? No longer tithe? No, a change in the high priest and to whom the tithes go. The high priest of what temple that goes to. So he says, verse 13, for he of whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe. Jesus Christ was of the tribe of Judah, which no man has officiated at the altar from Judah. For it's evident that our Lord arose from Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning the priesthood. And it is yet far more evident if in the likeness of Melchizedek there arises another priest who has come not according to the law of a fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life. For he testifies, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, there is an annulling of the formal commandment, the Aaronic Levitical sacrificial system, because of its weakness and profitableness. For the law made nothing perfect. On the other hand, there is the bringing of a better hope through which we draw near to God. Let's go finally to Acts 4. So the administration changed. The recipients of the tithes and the offerings also changed. Not done away with, but it changed. It changed to the priesthood of Melchizedek in service to the temple of God. And what is the temple of God? The temple of God is a spiritual temple. The temple of God is made up of the body of Christ. We are the church. The tithes and offerings go towards not the Levitical priesthood, but they go toward the temple of God, whose high priest is Jesus Christ. That work of the church continues through the tithes and offerings paid in service to the high priest of the line of Melchizedek. We see an example of that, as we see in different places here in Acts 4, in discussing how funds were gathered. Now, of course, they were in a specific situation, as Mr. Johnson talks about in his classes here in Acts, of staying on there for a period of time after Pentecost and to meet needs so everybody can stay there as long as they can to fellowship and be together. And we have folks selling items, but where do these funds go to care for the church? Who administers those funds? Acts 4, verse 35. Again, this is talked about before we get into the deception that took place with Ananias and Sapphira in chapter 5. But here talks about Barnabas, an individual who was very giving. So he took, verse 34, nor was there anyone among them who lacked, for all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and they brought the proceeds of the things that were sold, they laid them at the apostles' feet. And they, the apostles, distributed to each as anyone had need. So funds came in, and they came into the ministry, the apostles, who were overseeing everything at the time, and they were then distributing to the needs of the church and caring for the church in that way. Verse 36, and Joseph, who was also named Barnabas by the apostles, which is translated son of encouragement, a Levite of the country of Cyprus, having land, sold it and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. So as the administration changed, the recipients of the tithes and offerings also changed, but they were not done away with. There's no indication that any of that was was done away with. And as our writings have articulated in the past, far from this section of Scripture, meaning back to Hebrews 7, far from this section of Scripture stating that tithing is abolished, its thrust is primarily to support the return to a priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek. The New Testament church is now the temple of God. Tithing is a means of supporting the work of God and supporting the nourishing, the nurturing of the church. It's the means by which the temple of God is able to function in a way that when it is not looked after, we see the situation of the Levites going out and working in the fields, and the needs can't get done. I blew it because I forgot to finish that statement in Nehemiah. Let's go back to Nehemiah and close with that. Nehemiah 12, verse 44. When all that got taken care of, and Nehemiah righted all of those wrongs, and the tithes started coming in, look at how the temple responsibilities were cared for by the individuals who had no inheritance, by the individuals who God was their inheritance in that respect, and God looked after them. Verse 44, chapter 12. And at the same time were appointed over the rooms of the storehouse for the offerings, the firstfruits, the tithes, to gather into them from the fields of the cities the portion specified by the law for the priests and Levites. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and Levites who served. Both the singers and the gatekeepers kept the charge of their God and the charge of the purification according to the command of David and Solomon his son. For in the days of David and Asaph of old, there were chiefs of the singers and songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. In the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah, all Israel gave the portions for the singers and the gatekeepers, the portion for each day. They also consecrated holy things for the Levites, and the Levites consecrated them for the children of Aaron. As we close, young people age 4 and up, are you tithing when you make some money from mom and dad? When they pay you for some work that's done, are you tithing? And parents, are we sitting down with our children and helping them put together a plan to tithe? Next time, we're going to address a variety of topics under tithing, but some of those will be these. Are there situations where we are receiving money, yet may not be commanded to tithe on what we take in? How does that factor in with offerings? What about offerings? Were there to be funds set aside for the preaching of the gospel? What was all this about Paul not accepting support? We'll address that. Did he always refuse support? Let's look at some New Testament examples of how funds were administered. What it is to tithe on the increase and tithing from our labors. What about the subject of tithing on the gross and tithing on the net? What does the church teach about second tithe and third tithe? What is the church's teaching on third tithe? Has the church done away with third tithing? Is third tithe commanded by God? We'll talk about that. What about excess second tithe? What about the administrative statement of the tithe of the tithe? We'll address those next time. In the meantime, let's continue to be faithful in our tithing. By tithing, we obey God, we worship Him, we honor Him, we support His work, we support the work of the church in the spreading of the gospel, we support the nurturing of the church, and thus we receive the blessings that God intends for us to receive.